All right, once again, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our third panel on navigating global trade tensions. We have three distinguished speakers for this panel. Each panelist will address three questions, and they will be given 5 to 10 minutes to give their opening remarks before we open the floor to some Q&A. We asked the panelists to address the first question, which is in regard to the tariff rate on Philippine goods to 19%. We asked the panelists to think about some future objectives that the Philippines ought to reach for in future negotiations. A second question that we asked our panelists to ponder on would be the uncertainties that remain in American trade policy today. And the third is on how might the Philippines and other regional states seek to mitigate over-reliance on trade with the U.S. through other relationships and institutions. And with me on stage this afternoon are Philip Luck. He's the director of the economics program and the Scholl chair in international business at CSIS. Next to him is Barbara Weisel, a non-resident scholar, Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And to her left is Ela Tolentino, the distinguished professorial chair in China Studies at De La Salle University. So I think we will follow the program and have each of them deliver their opening remarks for a couple of minutes. Philip, I turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And again, thank you so much to the organizers for organizing a really excellent first day here, and looking forward to tomorrow as well. So before I sort of address the three questions that are the excellent questions that are posed, I want to sort of start with sort of thinking about the objectives of the American administration, which I think is important for thinking about what objectives the Filipino government should or could think about achieving in future negotiations. The first, I think, it's important to note that this administration is in some ways very committed to high tariffs. This is both it's a tool to achieve other objectives, but I also think it is an objective in and of itself. In many ways, the president believes that he came in, won the presidency on this policy. This is one of the policies he was as clear on as any others. And so I don't think there's a way in which we're going to see, in a broad sense, a move back to sort of multilateral MFN tariff rates in a broad scope. Again, and I think even if the United States goes into, or the economy slows, which it already is slowing, there's a lot of headwinds to a sort of broader pullback of tariffs. At this point, the administration is, reliant, or it is positioning itself as reliant on the revenue from tariffs, which they have been relatively substantial. I mean, they've gone from about 0.8% of revenue up to about 5%, which again is a pretty substantial amount of revenue. The president seems very interested in continuing to use tariffs as leverage. So as long as that objective is there and then the tools are available, which they broadly will be through 232 tariffs or 301, even if IEEPA becomes a tool he can't use anymore, he will continue to want to use these as leverage for other objectives. And then lastly, there's a strong, I would argue misguided, but strong objective of the administration to use tariffs to reindustrialize. To bring jobs or manufacturing back. Some of this is, just due to, and from my view, a sort of nostalgic view of the American economy of yore, but some of which is directly linked to a thing we've talked about a lot today, which is the strategic competition with China and the perception that we do not have the industrial base to compete. So I'd say that these are all objectives that are going to push against any sort of broad-scale reduction in tariffs. So where does that leave, a country like the Philippines? I think there's several things here. One is from a standpoint of the administration trying to reduce the trade deficit or trying to reindustrialize, they are most likely going to try to keep a relatively high, somewhat universal tariff rate, with, again, carve-outs for particular areas where imports are particularly important, including semiconductors. So, I don't think we'll see a reduction below sort of 15% or something like that. That said, I think there is areas for sort of strategic sectoral agreements where we can sort of lower areas in places where the administration has other priorities that go beyond sort of the domestic industrial base, whether that be shipbuilding, semiconductors, critical minerals. There's a lot of areas where it's very clearly in the administration's interest to lower trade barriers, and that's areas where I think we can sort of see areas come down. The last thing I would say, though, which is that, another objective beyond sort of lowering tariff rates, which I think, of course, I support, and that's obviously a goal that any administration should have, this administration is not going to stop coming for additional bites at the apple, right? So once one sort of bilateral economic irritant has been resolved, there will be another, right? So, we're seeing this with our other partners, including South Korea and the Europeans. Once some of the more trade-related issues are resolved, then the administration is going to move on to digital market regulation or other regulations, and so on. So, I think in some ways, until there's a relatively large change in perspective overall, I think there's some value in a do no harm approach, which is not to create additional areas for disagreement that can lead to sort of an escalation of relations. Now, I don't think the Philippines is anywhere near the top of that list and sort of risk there, but this administration can be somewhat mercurial, and so there's always a risk of sort of moving things in the wrong direction. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Philip. Barbara.
Thanks, and it's nice to be here. Thanks, Greg. Everybody's thanked you. I have to thank you, and thanks to all of the sponsors and hosts. This is really a wonderful conference. I wanted to focus on the 4 questions that I get asked the most about the Trump administration policy and how it affects countries in the region. And so I'm going to go through those one by one. The first is, how long will the uncertainty and unpredictability that we're seeing persist? And since you all stayed here till the end of the program today, I'm going to tell you exactly what day and time that unpredictability is going to end, so write this down. The answer to that question is that President Trump likes that unpredictability. He likes the uncertainty, and he likes to keep his opponents off balance because he thinks it gives him advantages. So I think that you will continue to see this uncertainty and unpredictability out as far as we can see. We have unpredictability separately as a result of challenges to the statutory authority that the president has used to impose tariffs. So the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the authority he is using to impose the reciprocal tariffs, has been challenged and is now at the Supreme Court. Regardless of what happens at the Supreme Court, I think you can expect the administration to use other authorities to maintain tariffs, and if people are interested, we can talk about what those authorities are. They are complicated and probably harder to use than the emergency authority he's using for the reciprocal tariffs, but nonetheless, they are available to him. The administration, I think, as you were pointing out, also has authorities to impose sectoral tariffs on top of these reciprocal tariffs, and we have those already on steel, aluminum, copper, autos, and auto parts, but there are many, many other investigations underway, some of which will affect the Philippines likely. And here I point to semiconductor chips and chip equipment, which I expect we'll hear about very soon, and critical minerals, where the administration also is doing investigations among the many other sectors that it has announced investigations on. So apart from those that we know about and we can predict, I think there is also the possibility of the administration imposing tariffs because of some political action that it is unhappy about. And we're seeing that in Brazil and India and other places where the administration has pushed a particular political objective and expects its trading partners to fall in line, or tariffs will follow. So there is the possibility that that will happen with any country, including the Philippines. Another area for traders, I think that is an area of uncertainty looking ahead, is rules of origin. So the administration has said, we're going to develop these rules of origin, and they're going to apply to goods that are transshipped through Asian countries primarily, but not necessarily Asian countries that come from China. And we're going to have rules that are going to talk about what kind of content needs to be in the product in order to determine whether they are products of a given country, the rules of origin. Those rules have not yet been made public, but I expect when they are, they will contain some surprises that will complicate the trade picture and the uncertainties ahead. Two other areas of uncertainties for the Philippines. So far, the tariffs are on manufactured goods. But there is no particular reason to believe that they will not extend at some point to services, on which the administration is getting political pressure. Last week, I was at a conference with some state legislators from around the U.S. who asked specifically about this issue, and specifically about call centers, which they said they thought the administration should be looking at, and that it is a it's a security issue for the United States. So I put that services generally, an area where the U.S. and Philippines have a very robust trade relationship, as another area of uncertainty. And finally, I point to agreements that the U.S. is making with other countries that are Philippine competitors. So the 10% global baseline tariff affected everybody. Nobody was happy about it, but nobody was disadvantaged. But then there was whatever tariff was on top of that each country faced. And so at the end of the day, the issue is, what was your tariff relative to your competitors? Not necessarily just what was the tariff, but what was your tariff relative to competitors? So as the Trump administration is negotiating specific agreements with countries around the region and around the world, some of those agreements are going to contain elements that provide special treatment to other countries that they may or they may not be offering to the Philippines, therefore putting you at a disadvantage. So I think those are uncertainties that are before us as we look ahead over the coming months. The second question we get is Trump trade policy temporary? Is there a goal that once they reach it, that they'll shift back to what we've seen before? You know, maybe lift some of the tariffs. How long is this going to go on? Or, you know, if there's a change in Congress in the midterm elections, will we see tariffs revert to earlier levels? My answer to that is not likely. Not likely that we're going to see tariffs revert in the foreseeable future. Tariffs have been significantly, Phil has pointed out, have been high over the past 8 months. The tariff revenue year to date is $183 billion. That $183 billion is now something that is seen as a legitimate revenue source for the budget. And you're even seeing arguments that tariff revenue will ease the fiscal pressure on the United States over the next decade. So I think as long as people start seeing it as a permanent, important revenue source, it's going to be very, very hard to roll back those tariffs. Even before we started thinking of them as a revenue source, tariffs have been very sticky. Once they're imposed, you have those industries that are benefiting from tariffs lobby quite hard to maintain them, and that tariffs, once in place, can stay for a long time. I point to what we call the chicken tax, the tariff that we put on trucks in the early 60s as part of a trade war we had with the EU. Well, that 25% tariff we have on trucks is a result of something that goes all the way back to the 1960s. So I think quite difficult to see them roll those back over the coming months. The third question is, does the Trump administration have a longer-term vision of where they want to take trade policy over the coming years? So they've been in the process of breaking the global trading system, trying to tear it down. What do they want to replace it with? And how does that fit with other countries' vision of where trade policy ought to go? Well, first thing I would say is they have not outlined a vision for where they would like to see global trade architecture. They have outlined a vision for what they see as U.S. trade policy, but not for what they see as a vision going forward. They have outlined grievances that their trade policy is supposed to address, but not a vision of what replaces it. And, last couple, I guess it was in July already, that USTR Jameson Greer put out an op-ed that tried to put a framework around the Trump trade policy. And he said, the U.S. had slashed barriers to allow the flow of goods, services, capital, and labor, but other countries kept their markets closed to the U.S. through various barriers. And so through the trade deals that they were negotiating, these bilateral deals, the U.S. is laying a foundation for a new trading order. But I think for those of us that follow trade, it's not clear what that new order is. It is clear that the U.S. is imposing unilateral demands, but it isn't clear where they hope to take the global trading system. It's also clear that other countries have kind of gone along. Other countries have not retaliated against the U.S. tariffs, judging it to be in their interest not to do so. But nobody has really contemplated what this means for the global trading system. The fourth question is, what should countries do in response, and what specifically here, what should the Philippines do in response to the U.S. trade policies? And so, as I said, I was at this conference over the last several days with these state legislators. I think one thing that's very important is that at the state and local level, people are really eager to try to find ways to find stability in the midst of all of this volatility that we're seeing. Many of the state legislators were interested in doing state trade missions and trying to find ways to work with other countries to find mutually beneficial ways to enhance the trade and the relationship between the parties. So I think there's opportunities there to see what can be done at the sub-federal level that can help bring some stability and benefits in the short term. You know, the Philippines itself has talked about the need to diversify its trading partners and is already doing so. I see the DTI last week, I guess, put out a statement about the importance of diversifying trade and other measures that it thought were important to ensure the Philippines maintains its competitiveness. What I would say to that is I think the Philippines needs to push the envelope a little farther and to move more quickly to keep up with its regional competitors. Quite a few of your trading partners, of your regional competitors, have agreements with major trading blocs like the EU that the Philippines is behind. And there's, you know, for countries around the world, and I know when I was in the government trying to decide which countries we should negotiate agreements with, the Philippines was always on the list, but it never made it to the top. And that was, I think, a result of the reaction that we got when we came to you with that interest. I think there's more of an interest now on the part of the Philippines in a bilateral with the United States. I have my doubts that the U.S. is necessarily ready to go there, but there are many other countries that are eager to negotiate with the Philippines. I also would suggest that the Philippines take a good look at CPTPP. When we were negotiating that agreement, the Philippines was not interested in becoming a member. Since then, and since CPTPP came into force, a lot of your regional competitors are either joining or seeking to accede to that agreement. So all of those, I think, are important. Just a couple of other things, and I want to wrap up. But there are a number of countries talking about finding a way to come together to work on initiatives that would be parallel to the WTO. That is to say, we don't want to do away with the WTO, but we need to find like-minded countries that are ready to deal with the challenges that we have right now in the global trading system. The Philippines needs to be part of those groups. It cannot sit on the sidelines. Its interests lie in participating in these groups and helping to set the next generation of rules. And lastly, I would say, even as the Philippines is looking to become more involved in initiatives around the world, it's important to continue to find ways to work with the U.S. Over the course of today, we've talked about a lot of ways that the two countries can work together. It is not in the Philippines' interest to intentionally antagonize the U.S. right now. And there are lots of areas that we've talked about where the two countries can work together. I think the strong security and military relationship will help. Trade is, the security and military relationship is being kind of sequestered, cordoned off from the broader relationship, so it doesn't insulate you from anything the administration may decide it wants to do on trade, but it does help improve the environment. And so I think to the extent that people can keep their eye on the ball on working on these, all of the things that we've talked about up until this session, I think that's a very important area to focus on as well. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And we now move on to Elaine's remarks.
Okay. Thank you once again to the CSIS team and to Greg for the invitation. What I would like to talk about two key points here. The first one is the future objectives. The first question is the future objectives that the Philippines ought to reach in future negotiations. And second, what the Philippines should do in order to increase its productivity, in order to, for its trade competitiveness. So for the first one, so the conclusion of a 19% tariff on Philippine imports to the United States, which took effect on August 1, should not raise too much alarm, at least for now, for the Philippine export sector and the overall economy or our GDP growth, okay? While the deal set is 2% higher than what was originally set in April, which was at 17%. The negotiation also included a list of exempted goods, right, from the reciprocal tariffs, which include cars, car parts, and semiconductors. And these are the country's top export products to the United States. So we won't know for sure what the overall impact of the reciprocal tariffs on the Philippine economy would be. But for a certain period, okay, there might not be a significant decrease, okay, in the country's exports and GDP. President Trump's unilateral reciprocal tariffs is causing a global panic as countries race to beat the deadlines they set for negotiations, pushing various states to the edge, okay? Particularly those which the United States has huge trade deficits with, but hopefully not, leading to a collapse, right? As what has been said by earlier. Still, okay, with this trade uncertainty on the rise, it highly affects, okay, the decisions of firms, okay, on whether to invest or hold on to their money until the storm has calmed. So, to lessen this uncertainty, the Philippine government in future negotiations should at least ensure that the tariffs would still be, okay, at 19%. And the list of product exclusion stays, as what was echoed earlier by the ambassador. And hopefully, okay, if the balance of trade becomes more optimistic for the United States, perhaps we could bargain or negotiate for lower products and include more product in the list of exclusions. Now, for the second point, in terms of raising productivity, the country's productivity, in terms of increasing the country's competitiveness, particularly among our Southeast Asian neighbors, in order to attract, this was mentioned earlier in the previous panels, we need to attract more investors. And in order to, more investors boost the productivity of local firms, and that could help them export their goods in more competitive prices. Two things that we need to take into account. First thing, we need to look at our own house. Okay? And second, we can draw inspiration, okay, from our neighbors in Southeast Asia. Why do I say look into our own house? We need a massive cleaning of our own house. The country is staring at a glaring corruption scandal, okay, right in the face. A distinguished colleague, okay, Dr. Julio Tehanqui, he wrote a book chapter on this in 2013, explaining how public works contractors have successfully integrated themselves into a web of local characteristic networks he termed politician contractors. The millions, if not billions of pesos acquired in these clientelistic transactions could have been used to improve the much needed infrastructure, okay, of this of the country, okay, which could have helped ease doing business, okay, lowering the cost. Apart from eroding the public's trust, okay, this undermines market credibility, okay, a reason to turn away potential investors. China's President Xi has a whole-of-nation approach to move the country in achieving the Chinese people's rejuvenation. The Philippines needs a whole-of-nation cure from national governments, the bureaucrats, down to the local governments, side by side with the private sector. The Philippines needs a change in mindset, which can begin from below. An example that was jump-started by LGU, by local governments, is the creation of a mayor, vice mayor's league of good governance, which can actually be extended to a league that shares best practices and helping improve the local business environment, starting with small steps, okay, to minimize corruption at the local level. In terms of looking at our Southeast Asian neighbors, it was the ambassador also mentioned earlier that the Philippines is the second largest growing economy in Southeast Asia, next to Vietnam. Okay. And Vietnam has, has surpassed us in terms of GDP by a few margins. Cambodia, okay, is also something that we could learn from. Okay. It's a war-torn country just a few decades ago, and now it's attracting more foreign investors. Okay. Another colleague visited Cambodia just a few weeks ago, and initially, he was not too keen on visiting because he has already seen, okay, that the not so orderly, okay, city, okay, of Phnom Penh. But after having visited, he said, "I feel sorry for the Philippines. Cambodia, okay, I've seen how Phnom Penh has improved so much in terms of the order, in terms of the cleanliness, and unlike us." I'm stating the obvious here, but the obvious is what the Philippines needs to reflect on and make a change. Okay, the country's economic ill, it's nothing new. Okay, but it is it's emerging in different forms that continue to prey on society. And given the looming uncertainty, okay, in the global economy, the Philippine government can no longer afford, okay, to ignore this. Otherwise, we may, just find solace in celebrating the country's rich potential, okay, but continue to miss on actual performance. We need to step up, okay, and that should start within our own house. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And the three panelists have actually given us a very comprehensive view of what we might see as continuing tensions in this arena. I know that our time is limited this afternoon, so I think I'd like to go straight to opening the floor for questions for anything that you might have in your heads and you want to raise to our panelists. I see a question here in the middle. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and affiliation, and if you would like to address your question to any panelist in particular.
Hello. Hi. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sam Beltran of the South China Morning Post. Thank you so much to the panelists for their insightful comments. If you don't mind, is it all right if I ask two short questions?
Short questions, yeah.
All right. Okay, so my first question would be, so how do you see U.S. tariffs playing out here in the region amid intensifying strategic competition against China? And my second question, I believe Barbara mentioned something about the Philippines being on the list of many countries wanting to negotiate with the Philippines in terms of trade. So I was just curious, what is stopping them from continuing? Like, what are the largest areas for improvement for the Philippines in that aspect? Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think for the first question, maybe I can ask Philip and Elaine to address that, and then the second one could be for Barbara. If you can repeat your second question for Barbara, please.
Yes, sure. Just in reference to what you said earlier about the Philippines being on the list of countries wanting to negotiate with them in terms of trade, What are the largest areas for improvement for the Philippines in that aspect? Basically, what is stopping these countries from continuing to further negotiate with the Philippines in terms of trade? Thank you.
Thank you. Philip.
So in the first question, how do I see the sort of tariffs playing out in the region? First thing I would say is I completely agree with Barbara that, you know, we're going to have sort of a baseline level of tariffs. The real question is going to be, are they at parity, or are you sort of above or below sort of regional and, you know, sectoral competitors? You know, I think rates are a little bit different, obviously, but hopefully, again, from an overall efficiency and also from a perspective of the Philippines' interest, you know, hopefully we can get to a place where those are relatively common across partners, with, of course, important carve-outs for sectors that are incredibly important to the Philippine economy and also for the U.S. economy. The other thing I would say, which also hits on something Barbara mentioned, which is, I think the biggest uncertainty I have is as these tariff rates are high, and they're going to be higher on the PRC than they are other regional partners, supply chains are going to reorganize. They're going to reroute, and there's going to be some level of, whether it's technically transshipment or not, there's going to be some level of embedded PRC content in goods that are going to be flowing through countries like the Philippines. And how the U.S. decides to react to that, how they, you know, try to play whack-a-mole, or what are how punitive they're going to be to embedded content, I think that's, to me, a big open question. That's a huge area of uncertainty. So as the Philippines is thinking about how to diversify supply chains to de-risk in some sense for the United States, which I think is, you know, only fair and wise thing to do given U.S. administration's behavior, I think it's important to sort of, at the same time, think about the ways in which any of that de-risking can potentially put the Philippines at risk of future punitive action should that de-risking move towards the PRC in certain ways, right? So that's the key thing that I'm concerned about here. There's other concerns, obviously, as well, but I think those are the main ones right now.
Thanks, Philip. Elaine, the question was on how you see the tariffs playing out in the context of U.S.-China tensions.
Well, definitely it will, in terms of the two countries, well, the United States has imposed one of the largest tariffs on China, right? As part of its, you know, how would you put it? In terms of the unfair trade practices that China has been pushing on the United States. China has been, you know, is one of the two countries that has imposed a tariff on the United States as well. But at the same time, the tariffs that the United States has placed on other countries, okay, depending on how high or low, may push these other countries, perhaps, as you know, I agree with you, to the side of China as well.
Thanks, Elaine. And for Barbara, what do you know, from Washington's perspective, what do you think is hindering the Philippines from advancing some of these negotiations?
Can I just make a comment on the previous question as well? That I think you're pointing to, you know, the countries in the region are looking at how does this play through the lens of the U.S.-China competition, in addition to how it affects them directly. And without exception, every country in the region has said, please do not make us choose. Every country in the region is very dependent on the U.S. market for their exports, but very dependent on the Chinese market for their imports and sometimes also for their exports. So I think everybody's going to navigate extremely carefully so they don't get crushed by one side or the other and try not to antagonize either side. What that argues for is diversifying your partners outside of the U.S. and China. I mean, we in the U.S. have, you know, in the first Trump administration and the Biden administration said companies should diversify away from China everyone said you can't diversify away from China, but you could. And companies started moving to this region. Now the US is saying, actually, that's not good enough. We want you to reshore to the United States. And companies are saying, we can't find ourselves in a situation where we're not competing in China and we're also not competing in the United States because we've diversified away from both. But I actually think that's what you're going to start to see. You're going to start seeing some more focus, not leaving the US market, not leaving the China market entirely, but looking to see how you can build trade with other countries so it's more balanced and you're not so vulnerable. You know, in terms of my questions about the Philippines and a bilateral trade agreement, has nothing to do with what does the Philippines have to do to become a potential partner. There are things that over the course of the time that we were negotiating bilateral or even regional trade agreements that were issues. But the U.S. has issues with every trading partner, and there weren't necessarily more with the Philippines than with anyone else. I mean, there's intellectual property, there were goods and services, tariff and non-tariff barriers, there are labor issues, there, you know, the list that's not necessarily distinct from what you would see with other countries. I think the question I have right now is that the Trump administration has gotten other countries to unilaterally eliminate their tariffs and has said, why should we lower our tariffs? We already have low tariffs relative to everyone else. So it takes a mind shift for them to say, you know what, let's do a bilateral trade agreement. We'll lower our tariffs to zero if you lower your tariffs to zero. Well, you've already lowered your tariffs to zero. So why would they think it's beneficial? They might, you know, it could be that at some point in the administration, they decide, actually, we do want to go back to doing trade agreements, and we're going to pick a country that we think we can negotiate with, and the Philippines is a good partner, let's do that. But is that an agreement that they're going to do through executive authorities, like they've been doing all of these other actions? Because if it's a trade agreement, a typical trade agreement, it needs to go through Congress. That means Congress, which has been essentially ignored through this administration, now has to be consulted. They might need to get trade promotion authority. All of these big questions about how the administration would deal with Congress and with stakeholders, and I don't think there's been any consideration of that to date.
Thanks. Next question, here in the middle.
Thank you. Matteo Piacentini from UP Diliman. So it was mentioned that the Philippines suffers an infrastructure gap, and this gap, we have indicators that is trying to be addressed by, for example, the Luzon corridor, which is something that is quite a novelty in Philippine-U.S. relations in many ways. My question is it something or a scheme of engagement that was possible thanks to the inclusion of other partners like Japan? Or is it something that can be replicated in the future, both at the advantage of the Philippines but also of other Southeast Asian countries? I'm thinking of the fact that these infrastructure initiatives were actually a way for China to pursue its charm offensive, and actually, yes, these countries don't want to choose, but at the same time, it was a way for a competing power to expand its influence. And the scheme was also tried here in the Philippines and probably contributed to tensions between the Philippines and the US in previous administration, because it constitutes a valid alternative and a very potent incentive. So my question is, what is the position of the United States towards these initiatives? Can it be replicated? What is the stake? And are partners that are already active in the region in infrastructure development like Japan, or perhaps what they aspire to, India, essential to pursue this strategy? Thank you.
Thanks, Matteo. Maybe Philip?
Sure, I can start by, I think the first thing I'll say is, I think this administration, they do not have sort of what I would call a very clear overarching strategy. So if you're looking for that, I think we'll have to keep looking. The other thing I would say is, in a pretty clear departure from the first Trump administration, there does not seem to be as much of a strategic economic focus, in my mind at least, to competition with the PRC. So I think, competing with sort of a Belt and Roads type initiative does not seem to be the objective as much. So I think those are a bit of headwinds to sort of that type of investment. And again, I think there's a huge focus on investment back into the United States. And so to the degree to which that sort of takes away from sort of priorities as well. But I don't know if others have thoughts.
Elaine, anything? Okay, thanks. Here in front.
I'm Martin O'Neill from ICTSI, and which, as you probably know, is in the container terminal business. And one observation followed by a question. There's a group of about 5 or 6 global container terminal operators, which obviously focuses on merchandise trade. They have portfolios of 30 to 40 terminals all over the world, so it's an interesting barometer of what's actually happening. The historical rule of thumb was that container volume growth globally was 1.5 to 2.5 times GDP growth. And that worked from about 1945 or the 50s when containers started through to the 2008 crisis when it dropped to about 1, if you were lucky. So far this year, all of the global operators are reporting volume growth of in the low teens, like 11 and 12%, which is a multiplier of more like 4 to 5 times. So either it's proving just how irrelevant the US is in the world of merchandise trade, or people didn't get the memo. But my real question is to the content rules, and we have some experience with this with a significant terminal in Mexico. It's no big secret that lots of Asian companies ship components to factories in Mexico where they then do the assembly and put the final good into the US, taking advantage of the more favorable NAFTA rates, et cetera. It's pretty difficult to police in practical terms unless you put US customs inspectors in Mexican ports. And if you think you're then going to replicate that all across ASEAN, that's a pretty big lift, at least in my estimation. But I don't know if you've heard anything about how the Trump administration thinks that's going to work.
Thank you. Maybe Barbara?
I think you make a very important point. When you talk to customs folks, they understand, or people in the private sector that are in the business, they understand the challenge. But I think what you're hearing from the administration is that through AI and other technical means, they're going to find a way to do this. We're seeing the challenges that have emerged from the elimination of the de minimis tariff alone. So I think you're quite right to point out how difficult this will be. But the flip side of that is that the administration will have the ability to enforce what it chooses, so it will be much more unpredictable as a process as you're trying to bring products in, and I think that's also a scary prospect.
Philip, maybe you want to add anything?
I would just say 2 seconds on that. I would say exactly agree with Barbara with it. They don't have to do it well to create a lot of cost and uncertainty. So that's the downside there. The other thing I would say is this is kind of an obvious point, but this is one of the great advantages of MFN tariff rates, where you have common tariffs across all partners. You don't create these massive incentives for basically trade diversion. So I think this is going to be something that we're going to see a lot of. It's going to happen. The other concern I would say is, I haven't seen a huge amount of focus on this yet, but there's a risk of, the U.S. administration starting to ask banks and financial institutions who are financing this trade, this essentially is, it's customs fraud, right? So there's risk in these financial institutions as well. I know there's a lot of banks are worried about this. We'll see what, again, there'll be a lot of this that happens. They're not going to be able to catch all of it, no matter what AI tools they try to bring to bear. But they can be punitive when they do find it, and that's going to be, we'll see how that goes.
Can I just footnote that to say, and that's assuming the rules of origin are common across all countries, which we don't know yet either.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? At the very back.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Assistant Vice President of the Philippine Institute of Arbitrators. So my question is, how the Philippines would leverage its function with regard to the ASEAN centrality model in terms of the U.S.-China rivalry, and at the same time would not be dependent, being an export-driven, but at the same time be an import-driven country. In that regard, how can the Philippines take an advantage on this particular scenario in the global trend? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Elaine, as the Filipino in the panel, maybe you'd like to address this question.
Next year, the Philippines will chair ASEAN, right? So one way to leverage ASEAN's strength vis-a-vis these two giants is to really push forward for tighter regional integration, right? There's a lot of opportunities that that the ASEAN member countries can take advantage of the more we regionally integrate. And at the same time, we've also talked about the economic diversification has already been mentioned, and also perhaps try to find ways. Okay, each individual country could also share best practices on how to provide support for those firms, manufacturing firms in particular, that will be affected by these tariffs. So there's from a regional perspective, but at the same time, some of these countries perhaps maybe, but they are our competitors. But at the same time, we also need to stick together in order to weather the incoming storm from the Trump administration.
Thanks. Barbara?
I just want to agree with you on that point and add, just from my personal experience, I was in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, and I was responsible for Southeast Asia and had to do ASEAN bilateral, U.S.-ASEAN bilateral, as well as the individual relationships. And as much as we talk about ASEAN centrality and how ASEAN can leverage the group and benefit from having the collective interest, they don't actually operate like that. And I think if ASEAN wants to get serious about really negotiating as a bloc, they have a lot of work to do. There's internal ASEAN agreements, and ASEAN has negotiated as a bloc with several countries around the region. But in negotiations beyond the region, it's been very difficult for them to maintain a singular negotiating position. In my experience, we tried to negotiate what we called a trade and investment framework agreement. This is essentially an agreement that's about a page and a half long that says, we promise that we're going to do a dialogue with each other every year. And we're going to talk about issues that we both care about every year. It's an agreement to talk. It took us 3 years to negotiate that page and a half document. And I think, the level of frustration, shall we say, was high. And the idea that you could negotiate an agreement, a really detailed actual trade agreement in those kind of circumstances, I think is far-fetched. So it is also a mindset change about the way ASEAN thinks about engaging with trading partners.
Thanks. I saw another hand on the left side of the room, your left.
Hi, I'm Maui from the Department of Migrant Workers, Institute for Advanced and Strategic Studies on Migration and Development. So the conversation here is mostly about tariffs, uncertainties, trade diversification, enhancing competitiveness and productivity. But my question will be coming from the perspective of labor mobility. For the Philippines, we send many workers to services, manufacturing, and logistics globally. And these are sectors that are directly affected by these trade tensions. So my question would be, do you see the global supply chain realignment sustaining demand for migrant labor in these areas? Or will labor-sending countries like the Philippines need to prepare for a shift toward different types of work as trade strategies evolve? Thank you. I think that question is directed more for Philip, but we welcome questions from the other panelists as well.
Thanks, Maui. Philip.
Does this work? Oh, there we go. Thanks so much. It's a great question. I would say, I mean, no one knows exactly what's going to happen, obviously, a lot of uncertainty. I would be surprised if the current trade tensions and U.S. tariffs make a marked, reduction in demand for those types of labor. I would say the main sort of risk there would be if we get into a global retaliatory cycle. Again, as the U.S. tariff rates are high and they're not globally efficient, but the estimates I've seen are a decrease in global GDP of less than 0.5%, relatively minor. These are going to increase costs, but as long as they sort of increase costs relatively equally, they're not going to have huge impacts on global supply chains, or they probably will not. Again, if we get into a retaliatory cycle and we sort of see a global trade war, all bets are off in some sense. I would say more broadly, I would say, these are not good. They reduce costs, they increase costs, they reduce efficiency. But global supply chains it's remarkably difficult to really reorient these in a significant way. And again, as we sort of mentioned, this uncertainty also leads to sort of holding back on investments. And those investments would be necessary to sort of reorient the supply chains. So I would be surprised if we see anything that's that large. Maybe on the margin, small things, but I don't think that's a huge concern.
I would agree with you on further increasing the labor productivity of the people here, as in fact give them more training in industries that would be less sensitive to the price fluctuations that's going to happen due to the Trump's tariffs.
Thank you. Over here to the far left.
Good afternoon. I am Ashley Salle from the French Chamber of Commerce. I actually have two questions for the panelists. First is, what is stopping Trump from adopting subsidies in order to protect its domestic industries? And how do you see this decision backfiring later on? Second question would be, what could be the possible strain on the relationship between the ASEAN countries who have almost the same type of raw materials?
Thank you. Are your questions addressed to anyone in particular?
Yes, Miss.
Anyone? Okay.
So the first question was what's stopping Trump from adopting subsidies, essentially, to protect domestic industry? So it's a great question. I think there's a few things. I mean, one, there's, I think, just a ideological dislike of sort of direct industry subsidies. They see, this group seems to think about that as picking winners. You can see that in, you know, the actions they've taken against parts of the IRA. I would say the other reason is that, you know, that would, in most ways, require Congress. And this administration seems much more interested in sort of using tools they can use from the executive branch unilaterally, which, you know, at least under the current rules, they can do that with tariffs. So again, tariffs are as costly, if not more costly economically, in my opinion, than our subsidies, but that's the sort of tool they have. That's the tool that they like the most, and the tool du jour. So I think that those are the main points I would make there. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Barbara, any insights? What's stopping Trump from giving subsidies to some of these? Is that correct? Yeah. The other question is, considering that ASEAN countries have the same raw materials, you know, what's the comparative or competitive advantage of these countries?
Well, I'm going to answer the second question since Phil's already answered the first one, and I would say in lieu of subsidies, what the administration has done for some sectors is to include purchase agreements as part of the bilateral reciprocal tariffs. And so that isn't a subsidy, but it is if you're in agriculture or you're in military sales or aircraft, you know, that those are additions to the reciprocal agreements that are trying to offset the losses that you would have otherwise have from the tariff policy. You know, in terms of the relative competitiveness of one ASEAN country to another, as you look across the region, you know, I used to keep a map in my office of countries that, who should we negotiate with? Who should we approach for an agreement? And I kept on saying to people that I needed another country. None of them were quite were free of some of the political or economic issues that would create complications in negotiating a trade agreement. I think the difference that I saw between the countries was not necessarily who's more competitive or who started out with a system that was more aligned with what we were looking for. It was which countries at a political level were most engaged and most serious about stepping up to make the kinds of changes that they would need to make in order to join a trade agreement that we considered next generation. For each country that has to negotiate a trade agreement and make changes to their system, if you have a democratically elected system and a vibrant democracy, it is complicated to make changes to policies that are going to create political pushback. If you are in a more authoritarian system, it's easier to do that, and you don't have to worry as much about the political pushback. But for some countries, even when there is political pushback, at a political level, they've decided that in order to enhance their competitiveness and put themselves ahead of their regional rivals, you know, their regional economic rivals or competitors, they're going to make some very difficult decisions, even at the cost of having to take on some political battles. Some countries have decided, for instance, to unilaterally lower tariffs because that would make them more competitive. And I think what we've seen sometimes from the Philippines is doubt that it's worth taking on those political battles or that they have the wherewithal to win them domestically, so they step back from opportunities that might otherwise be there for them.
Thanks. Elaine, anything to add about ASEAN? Okay. I see another question at the very back.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is quite a very challenging interactive discussion with regards to global trade tensions. So my question is all about how can the new policies of the United States on tariff restrictions accommodate the opportunities and the challenges with regards to the Philippine policies on trade liberalization as well as the ASEAN integration? And how can the court reinforce its role in terms of balancing the interests of the state in terms of attaining the economic goals of the state as well as the human rights perspective? This is Attorney Irene Valones from the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Thank you so much.
We would appreciate it if you can repeat the question. Sorry, the audio from where we are is a little bit iffy.
I thank you.
And we really can't see you, so would you mind if you can, yeah, we hear a voice, but we don't see who's the speaker. Yeah, go
Thank
ahead.
you.
Yeah.
So my question po is all about how can the new policy of the U.S. on tariff restrictions can create opportunities and challenges with regards to the Philippines policies on trade liberalization and the ASEAN's integration? And how can the court reinforce its role in terms of balancing the interests of the state in terms of the economic goals as well as the important human rights protection in terms of trade liberalization, even though we already have the amendment of the new Foreign Investments Act as well as the new Public Service Act? Thank you.
Thank you. So trade liberalization and ASEAN. Any insights? Elaine?
I think this has been echoed earlier, but yeah, with regards to Trump's policies and that of ASEAN, as Barbara mentioned earlier, ASEAN needs to come together, right, to the table and push back, whatever pushback means for ASEAN. Otherwise, it's given that the Trump administration is bent on imposing these tariffs, it will never work for ASEAN.
Thanks. All good. Okay. All right, nothing on this side of the room, but I see another hand here. We still have a bit of time, so please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I am Pao Balmes from Mitsubishi Corporation. My question is really on the intangible tariffs. So Trump also threatened tariffs that discriminate American technology, basically digital taxes or related regulations. And for the Philippines, we have 12% VAT for non-residential digital services. My question is, what could be the potential impact of this in case, not only for the Philippines, but also for other countries, since we're a very interconnected world right now?
Thank you. Intangible tariffs.
I think that there's a high probability that the administration will begin to pursue action against digital services taxes. They have been focused more heavily on discussions with the EU on this issue. And you saw in the US-UK deal, the US did not reach an agreement on anything to do with digital, but made clear that they were going to come back to that. President Trump himself has tweeted about this in recent weeks, and so you can tell that it's on his mind. And so I would say, there's been discussions with Canada, there's been discussions with the EU on this. It may be that whatever it is the U.S. decides to do, it does first with others, but then intends to carry it over to the other trading partners, and then the Philippines would be included in that.
Okay, any more questions? If there are none, please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their insights in this panel. I will turn the floor over to Greg now.
Thank you, everybody. I will keep this short because I know it's been a long day. I just want to say thank you all very much for joining us for the first day. I hope all of you will be able to make it back tomorrow for the second day of the Manila Strategy Forum, which will open with the keynote remarks by President Marcos. And I have to reiterate that you must be in the room by 7:45. It's not up to us. Much more powerful people at Malacanang will make sure that those doors do not open from 7:45 until the president leaves. So with that, thank you all very much, and I hope to see you tomorrow.